Heat shook the horizon over the mesquite, draw the air thin as glass. Cole Maddox rode at a walk, his hat brim pulled low, his eyes on the ground more than the sky. Comet's hoofbeats tapped a dry rhythm. The mare he had lost in the night had cut east then north, or so the scuffed crescents in the hardpan suggested. Tracks on bad soil lied often. Cole kept looking anyway. The pocket watch in his vest ticked in a lazy way, 7 minutes slow always. He never fixed it. Out here time behaved like horses. Sometimes it stood, sometimes it bolted. A twitch in the wind carried a smell that was not sage or dust. A sour hint like rope sweat, like singe. Comet's ears came forward. Cole leaned and swung down. He looped the reins over a mesquite branch and moved toward a line of cottonwoods that clawed a ribbon of shade out of the heat. He heard it then. Not the wind. A half-breath wet and small. He eased his rifle free without hurry. He stepped between trunks, knotted like old hands, and let his eyes learn the dark, the way a person does when walking into a church. The ground was stamped, scuffled, dug where heels had kicked. Bark had fresh cuts. Above, from a thick limb, a length of hemp rope hung tight around a pair of wrists. A girl hung from it, weight-slumping toes dragging weakly in the dust. Someone had nailed a plank to the trunk with square nails. The paint had bled into the grain. "Half-breed, keep out." For a moment Cole did not move. The words hung heavier than the body. He set the rifle butt on the ground and slid the barrel behind his elbow. He spoke like he was talking to a spooked horse. "Easy." Her head lolled toward him. One eye puffed shut. The other was open just enough to catch a slice of afternoon. Her lips had split and gone pale. The skin at her wrists was chewed raw under the rope. Flies worried the salt at the corners of her mouth. He stepped close and drew a knife from his belt. Steel flashed once in the heat blink. The rope fibers were packed and old, but the blade bit fast. He put his shoulder under her before the last strands let go. Her weight fell into him all at once. She was light and burning hot. Not today, he said more to the tree than to her. She sagged against his chest with a sound that belonged inside a chest, not out in the air. He crouched and laid her on the dirt in the thin shade. He tipped water from his canteen into a clean rag and touched the wet to her lower lip. She flinched and then drank like an animal, quick and careful, afraid the water would leave. He had to pull the cloth back to make her breathe. "Slow," he said. "You got time." Her hands tried to rise, then failed. The left one was clenched around something. He pried her fingers open. A tiny copper bead rolled into his palm, green at the edges, warm from her heat, a piece from a broken necklace or a prayer. He put it in his vest pocket, the one with the slow watch. "Name?" he asked. Her lips moved. No sound came. Her throat worked like swallowing hurt. He did not press. He looked once more at the sign and the fresh nail heads below it. Then he lifted her, stood with her weight in his arms, and carried her back through the cottonwoods. Comet sidestepped, blowing softly. Cole eased the girl up across the saddle and tied a loose knot in the horn that would keep her from sliding. He walked beside the horse, his hand on her back to stop the shake. The cabin sat low in the draw, almost part of the dirt. Mesquite shadow reached across one wall. The door stuck from heat. Inside it was cool, cedar-smelling quiet, like a room that had memorized silence. Cole laid her on his bed under the window and pulled a wool blanket up to her collarbone. He set the rifle against the far wall where he could get to it in a single step. He lit the lamp and warmed water on the iron stove. He cut strips from a clean shirt, boiled them, and laid them out on the table beside a tin of salve and a needle he had sharpened with a whetstone until it sang. He washed his hands in the basin. He did not speak. He had learned long ago that words wasted breath when there was work. He cleaned her face first so she could be seen. The cloth came away rust-red and brown. Under the grime, her skin was wind-dark, the line of her cheek sharp from thirst. He wiped at the bruising under the eye and left it alone when she flinched. He cleaned the cuts on her shoulders and the cracked places at her lips. He saved her wrists for last. The rope had done its work. Flesh had puffed and torn in lines. He breathed through his nose and worked slow. He slid the tip of the needle under the worst of the fibers, teased them out without breaking more skin, then worked salve into the raw. He wrapped each wrist with boiled cloth, not tight enough to bite, not loose enough to slip. He tied the knots with his thumbs and 2 fingers, the way he tied hackamores that had to hold and still let a horse breathe. When it was done, he sat back and let his own shoulders drop. He poured a cup of water and set it on the table by the bed within reach. Her eyes had opened a little. They tracked the cup, then him, then found the window and stayed there. "I ain't the men who did that," he said. She blinked once, nothing else. He pulled a chair to the door where he could see the yard and the bed both. He laid the rifle across his lap and set the pocket watch open on the table by his elbow. Outside, wind combed the coarse grass. A hawk circled. In the cabin, the little flame in the lamp made the walls breathe. At some point, her breathing evened. The tremor in her hands settled. She slept without sound, like sleep had to be learned again. Cole sat and sharpened his knife against the stone in short, soft strokes. The rasping had a comfort to it. He stopped when the blade would shave a curl from his thumb hair without a tug. Dark came down. He lit a second lamp and trimmed both until the glass went clear again. He boiled more water and left it to cool. He ate jerky and a heel of bread standing beside the stove so the crumbs would fall where he could sweep them. He listened for horses, for men, for a bad kind of quiet. He heard only the wind and the scratch of a mouse in the wall that quit when he looked. Sometime in the night, she woke hard, a whole-body jerk, a gasp like drowning. Cole stood, but did not go to her. He showed his hands empty. "You're in my house," he said. "You can leave when you can stand, or not, but you are not theirs." Her gaze moved from the door to the rifle to the water to him. She did not answer. She reached for the cup in a slow way that asked permission without words. He nodded. She drank and coughed and drank again. When her hands shook too much, he took the cup and set it back on the table. He went back to the chair. He tilted his hat down and let his eyes close without sleeping. Dawn came with a gray breath that smelled like dust before rain that would not fall. The girl's color looked more like a person's and less like paper. Cole stepped out to the porch and let the morning find him. He scanned the yard with the same patience he used on trails. Near the old stone well, the soil held a clean imprint where it had not yesterday. A boot heel, narrow and deep, the toe turned toward the cabin. Beside it, a curl of light ash. He knelt and touched it. Virginia tobacco, still warm enough to smear. Comet snorted from the lean-to. Cole stood and looked to the mesquite ridge where the draw curled out of sight. The pocket watch in his vest ticked like a lazy insect. 7 minutes slow. He pressed his thumb to the lid and shut it. "Someone's already counting our time," he said to the yard, and then he went for the rifle. Cole brought the rifle inside and set it within reach on the table. The girl slept with her face turned toward the window, breath small but steady. He watched the gentle pull of the blanket at her ribs, then looked back at the open door. The yard lay quiet in the pale wash of early sun. Nothing moved but light. He brewed coffee that tasted like iron and smoke, then let it sit until the grounds fell. He drank and waited for the world to show its hand. When the heat began to raise the smell of creosote, he stepped to the bed and touched 2 fingers to the cloth on her wrist, warm, damp, not bleeding. Her eyes opened to slits. "You can sit up if you want," he said. She nodded. He put an arm behind her shoulders and eased her higher, then scooted a pillow into place. She winced, then found a breath that did not hurt, and held to it. He set a cup of watered coffee in her hands. She cupped it like a stove in winter and sipped until color came back to her mouth. "Food?" he asked. She shook her head, then thought better and nodded once. He tore a piece from a small loaf and soaked it in broth. The spoon clinked the tin. She took slow bites, throat moving with the focus of a person learning a task again. She did not talk. He did not ask. He stepped out to the porch after and scanned the ridge. The boot print by the well had begun to lose its edges. The curl of ash had gone to nothing. He checked Comet's cinch and dragged a crate against the doorframe to shorten the view inside. His pocket watch ticked thick and late against his ribs. By afternoon, the heat had a weight to it. The air inside the cabin had gone soft. He opened the window and set the lamp glass aside to catch a weak breeze. The girl moved her legs over the side of the bed and placed her feet on the floor. He crouched and checked the linen at her wrists. It held. She stood and did not fall. She took 2 steps to the door and stopped blinking at the light like a creature from a mine. He stood behind her and let the open space do the speaking. She crossed the threshold and into the yard, her toes sinking a little in the warm dust. She squinted toward the cottonwoods and the slice of shade that had been the last thing her body remembered. Silence lay between them, not empty now, just wide. She crouched near the hardpack and picked up a stick. The end drew slow at first, then faster. Lines took shape with purpose. A beak hooked sharp, wings out and up, tail split like tongues of flame. A bird with thunder in its chest. Cole stood a step back. What bird flies into fire? She did not look at him, the one that does not ask permission. He let that sit. He looked at the ground where the lines cut. The image held like a brand. He glanced at her wrists, at the careful knots he had tied. He felt the urge to retie them, to be sure, fought it back and let his hands stay at his sides. She sat back on her heels and blew dust from the drawing. The dust lifted and came back like ash denied. She swallowed and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Her voice came small but clear. My mother used to paint this on our tent poles. She paused to find air, said it kept eyes open while crossing fire. Cole nodded simple like to a horse that had finally turned. Your mother had sense. She put the stick down. Her fingers worried the edge of the bandage as if testing the memory of the rope. He watched her move away from the habit, as if turning from a cliff ledge and back to ground. A line of dust showed on the far ridge before sound rode it. Cole saw the glint of metal. He moved without rush and stood in the doorway. 3 riders cut across the draw in a clean formation that did not belong to this country. Brass-flashed boots polished the wrong kind of shine. Comet raised his head and snorted. The lead rider was lean and straight in the saddle. The eagle on his hat caught light. He reined in at the fence and looked at the house like it had surprised him by holding together this long. His voice carried neat. Afternoon. Lieutenant Abel Granger, United States Cavalry. Cole Maddox, is it? Cole gave one nod. It is. Granger reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet. He did not hand it over yet. He let the paper hang like a thin thread. His eyes slipped past Cole toward the shadow where a bed might be. We are looking for a woman. Name of Mira Vale. He opened the paper. The sketch was rough, the eyes hotter than the line could catch. Wanted for murder and escape. Reward $75. She is considered dangerous to herself and others. I am obliged to ask if you have seen anyone passing through. Cole looked at the paper, then at Granger, then at the lack of dust on the man's boots. I tend horses, Lieutenant, not posters. Granger smiled with his mouth and not his eyes. Do you live alone, Mr. Maddox? Always have. Mind if we take a look? The lieutenant's hand made a light gesture that tried to be polite. I do mind. Cole kept his tone flat and his hands open. The rifle leaned against the wall inside where he could count the steps to it. I value a quiet room. One of the soldiers shifted in his saddle and let his gaze crawl over the window opening. Granger cleared his throat and settled his reins. For a beat, the 3 of them were a picture in dry heat. Granger folded the paper careful and set it back inside his coat. If you see anything unusual, we will be camped north of the wash. Pass the word. Cole blinked slow. I will not be north of the wash. The lieutenant's smile thinned. He tipped his hat with 2 fingers and turned his horse. The trio walked their mounts away with that even military tempo that made dust look square. Cole watched until the ridge took them. He stood in the doorway a little longer. The house behind him was cool and still. He let his shoulders drop, then turned inside. The girl stood by the table, hands wrapped around herself like she was trying to keep heat from leaving. She had heard everything. Why did you lie? She asked. She did not say his name. It still sat between them like a horse that had not yet decided. He hung his hat on a peg. He met her eyes. Because I look at you and I do not see what they printed. That is enough. Her mouth shook and stopped. She nodded once and sat. He poured water and set it there. She drank without looking at him. He sat in the corner again, the rifle within reach, the knife on his knee, the pocket watch open to its late face. They sat with the quiet, as if it belonged to both of them now. Shadows made a second cabin on the walls. The lines of the Thunderbird on the yard held in the heat until the light softened and the edges blurred. Near sundown, a knot of riders showed up the way storms do on a flat lake. Fast, loud, too many. 5 men broke the clean line of the draw and pulled up hard enough to throw gravel. At their front sat a man with a grin that had known better days and liked the worse ones more. His vest carried old scuffs where a badge had been. He swung down with the weight of a man who had told himself this was his land so many times he believed it. Well, hell, he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Cole Maddox, you always were a kind heart for strays. Cole stayed on the porch. The rifle leaned in the shadow behind him. He felt the old tug to end things fast and ignored it. The man tapped his chest with 2 fingers. Buck Hanley, you remember me? I remember you. We are here for a girl. Half-breed burned down a settler camp out by Silver Basin. Cut a man with his own knife. You seen her? Cole said nothing. Buck spit into the dust and took 2 lazy steps toward the stairs. We are going to look around. That all right with you? No. Buck blinked like a man who had been slapped with a wet glove. He smiled wider. Careful how you talk to me, Cole. Cole stepped off the porch slow as sunrise, his hands low at his sides. You are not invited. One of Buck's men lifted a rifle in a way that tried to be casual and failed. Cole turned his head and caught the angle. He moved before the man's elbow set. He closed the distance and caught the barrel with both hands twisted and let the wood bite into the man's knuckles. The rifle clattered. Cole drove a shoulder under another man's ribs and sent him into the fence rail. The impact rang like a bell. A third swung wild. Cole ducked and came up inside the swing. His forearm cracked the bridge of a nose with a sound like a boot on dry stick. Dust rose and stung the back of his throat. Horses danced and shied. Buck stepped back, then stepped forward again, hand dropping toward the comfort of iron he had not fully committed to this meeting. Cole did not draw. He moved the fight into the space where hands know each other better than guns do. The youngest of the five froze with his mouth open. He could not have been more than 17. Cole turned his head enough to meet the boy's stare and let a growl carry the choice. Ride. The boy yanked his reins and did exactly that, fear jerking him clean. The others hesitated. One scrambled after his rifle and thought better of it when he saw Cole's stance. Buck wiped his nose where dust had glued itself into wet. "This is not over," Buck said. The laugh in it had no humor. "For you it is." Cole's voice was quiet. He did not believe it in any big way. He meant it in the small way that mattered. Buck gathered his men with a curl of his fingers. They mounted in a slop of curses and hard faces. They wheeled and went the sound of their horses rolling down the draw and away. Cole stood alone in the yard chest, rising dust laying slow on his skin. His knuckles had a new split. He wiped them on his pants leg and looked at the cabin. She was in the doorway. Bare feet on the plank, the blanket Cole had given her hanging from her shoulders. Her eyes were darker than the room behind her. She took one step down, then another. She came to him and stopped close enough to hear his breath. "Cole," she said. His name sat clean in her mouth. He answered with a nod. The light at the edge of the day made the lines of the Thunderbird on the hardpack catch and glow. Something in her face let go that had been holding too long. She did not cry. She tilted her forehead a little as if listening to his chest through air. He raised his arms and set them around her, not tight, just enough to make a circle where the world could not reach. Evening gathered itself in the mesquite. The sky went to copper, then to bruise. When they stepped back, she looked past him toward the ridge. He followed her gaze. Far off, a single ember pricked the dark where there should have been none. It held, winked, and held again. Night settled in tight. The ember on the ridge sank until the dark took it. Inside the cabin held their breathing and the small scratch of fire in the stove. Cole sat in the chair by the door hat on his knee knife across his palm. He turned the blade to the lamplight and watched it go to gold, then silver, then nothing. The girl sat at the table with her hands around the cup, like it could teach her fingers to be steady. She looked up. The lines in her face were not the same as at noon. Something had moved, even if it had not moved far. "Mira is for hiding," she said. "My name is Sarah Redbird." The room took the name without a sound. Cole let it sit between them until he could hear it without thinking of the sign on the cottonwood. "All right," he said. She put a hand on her chest, then lifted it and laid it against the place over his heart. Not long. Just enough to mark where to knock if a person had to come back from a long way off. He did not move. When she drew her hand away, he caught it and turned her wrist to look at the bandage. The cloth had spotted where the salve had done its work. He loosened the knot and retied it a hair softer. His thumbs finished with a neat tuck, the same way he settled a hackamore that had to hold in a run. He reached into his vest and took out the tiny copper bead. He rolled it across his knuckles and felt its weight. He offered it with his palm open. She held her breath and touched it like touching a coal to see if it had finished burning. She smiled without showing teeth. "My mother stitched beads like this into a string," she said. "Soldiers cut it. I kept this one. I thought if I kept it I would not lose all of her." Cole nodded. "Keep it still." She closed her fingers over it and slipped it under the edge of the bandage so it would not fall when sleep came. She watched his hands work. There was a shape to the way he did small tasks. Cut, fold, tie. He put things where they belonged and left them there. It made a kind of quiet that a person could sit inside. He set water to warm again and cleaned the needle. He checked the pistol and worked the lever of the Spencer to feel the click and the seat. He did it slow and did not try to hide it. Her eyes followed the metal, then his breath. He held out the rifle. "Thumb here," he said. "Shoulder takes the kick. Breathe before you aim. Breathe after." She put her hands where he showed her and found the way the wood wanted her grip. She worked the lever once and listened to the sound it made. She did not ask questions. She nodded when her hands learned something they would remember. Outside, the wind moved and touched the cabin with a dry hand. A long hour went by, then another. When she stood, she did it without wobble. She went to the door and looked at the night like a person who has walked it and come home in one piece. She stepped out with the blanket around her shoulders and knelt on the hard earth where her drawing had been. The edges had blurred. She took a bit of charcoal from the stove box. She redrew the beak, the wings out, and up the tail like tongues of flame that would not quit. "This is my mother's word for crossing fire," she said. Cole set his hand on the ground near the bird. Flat, fingers spread, dirt under nails he had clipped with the same knife he used on rope and bread. Sarah looked at his hand there and let a breath go that had been stuck behind her sternum. Morning found them at the fence. A hawk cut the light with steady wings. Cole lifted the old spyglass and glassed the north. Dust lifted over the wash in a straight line. Metal flashed in a way that was not a farmer's. A flag moved not wild, not lazy, just the way a thing moves when it is sure of where it is going. "They are coming," he said. Sarah stood by the post with both arms around herself. She did not lean. She watched the line with eyes that did not blink in the bright. "You knew they would," she said. "I did." He put the glass down and felt the weight of the choice he had already made. It settled where choices sit in the back of the throat, heavy as a stone, and somehow easy to carry once you pick it up. He went inside and took his hat off and set it on the table like a man who's going to say a simple thing that will change every other thing. "Stay if you want," he said, "but I cannot hold this ground and hold you both. This land is good for horses. It is bad for quiet. South of here there are places where a person's face is not the first thing counted." She stood across from him and put her palms flat on the table between them as if to feel the grain and the history worn into it. "I'm not afraid of them," she said. "I know." He stepped closer. "I'm asking you to live, not to hide." She held his look. She did not blink. Her voice found a steady rung. "Then we go." There was no plan on the table, only a string of tasks that a body could pick up without argument. Cole gathered jerky, a canteen, a blanket, and a tobacco tin with clean cloth and a small jar of salve. He rolled a length of boiled linen and tied it with a piece of rawhide, neat knots ends snug. He checked the saddles, ran a hand along cinches, felt for weak places with a thumb and a knuckle. He saddled Comet and a second horse that had a good walk and a calm way of looking at the world. Sarah braided her hair and tied it with a strip torn from the inside hem of her dress. She opened a drawer and found a red thread tucked there from some old shirt that had seen better days. She looped it around her neck and tied it so the bead could rest against skin when she put it there. She tore her dress at the bottom to make her steps free. She took the Spencer, lifted it to feel its weight, and set it by the door. Cole stood in the doorway and looked back once into the room that had learned their names. He did not move through it like a man leaving a life. He moved through it like a man closing a gate. He lifted the lamp and turned the wick down just enough to keep glass clear. He set the pocket watch on the table and listened to its late tick. He pocketed it again. On the sill by the door, Sarah pressed the bit of charcoal to the wood. She drew a small thunderbird where a thumb would brush when a person came and went. She scratched 2 lines under it, the mark for eyes open. She looked at the black on her fingers and wiped it on her skirt. For crossing fire, she said, not to him, not to herself, just to the room. They led the horses out into the draw as the sun struck the ridge. The world smelled like warm dust and creosote. Cole checked the girths one last time. He watched Sarah set her foot in the stirrup and swing up with a small sound in her throat, the kind of sound a person makes when something old lets go. They rode at a trot until the draw got tight, then at a walk. A covey of quail burst from the brush and ran with their heads down like small men late for dinner. Sarah looked once to the north and then kept her eyes where her hands needed them. The copper bead rode against her skin. She touched it with 2 fingers when the trail turned mean. Cole glanced at her and saw the way her shoulders took the saddle now. Not hunched, not stiff, set to work. He felt something settle in his own chest that had been standing since yesterday. The horses breathed even. The leather creaked. The day offered its long light, and they took enough of it to keep ahead of heat. They reached the flats by late afternoon. The sky turned the color of old bone. Shadows grew long and thin. Sarah pulled her horse up at the edge of a wash and pointed with her chin. A line of prints crossed below. Mule, shod, 2 riders. Not fresh, but not a week old either. She did not speak. Cole nodded. They eased down and up, careful to leave less sign than they found. They followed the dry creek bed until the stones under hoof turned to fine powder and stuck to the fetlocks. Cole raised a hand and they stopped to listen. The world offered wind and a hawk, nothing else. Sun slid lower. The heat backed off. The trail curved toward a low run of rock. The moon lifted pale and tired already up before the sun had fully quit. Cole felt the horses lengthen their steps. Sarah set her jaw eyes cutting ahead for clean ground. They entered the notch where rock rose on both sides. The air cooled. The sound of hoof on stone came back at them in small echoes. Sarah lifted her chin to the sliver of sky above, then brought it down to the path. She did not see the glint until it moved. The shot cracked the notch open. It hit the quiet like a hammer. Cole rocked in the saddle. Red spread under his palm fast as spilled dye. His teeth clicked with the jolt. He slid and caught leather with his free hand breath blown clean out of him. Colsira said, voice low and fierce, and then she was off her horse and at his side. She had hands on him before the sound had finished ringing. The copper bead thumped once against her collarbone and went still. The echo of the shot trailed off into stone. Cole sagged. Blood slid warm through his fingers and pooled where his belt met his shirt. Sarah hooked an arm under his ribs and pulled. His boot scraped rock. He hissed through teeth and tried to keep his feet under him. She dragged him toward a crease in the wall where floodwater had chewed a shallow trench. Dust puffed with each step and stuck to sweat. Down, she said, voice flat. He went to one knee and then both. His breath came short and quick. He tried to look behind her. She pressed a palm to his wound and felt a hard surge of blood between her fingers. Look at me, she said. He did. The world seemed too bright around the edges. He reached for her wrist and found the linen there warm from her skin. They tied you once, he said, words thin. I will not leave you in their rope. Then breathe so I can work. He nodded because that was the only job he could do. She pulled the Spencer from the scabbard and checked the chamber without thinking. Thumb here. Shoulder takes the kick. Breathe before. Breathe after. She set the barrel across the lip of stone and peered through a slit of shade. Two figures moved along the notch, blue on their coats, brass at the throat. A horse flinched behind them at the smell of powder. One man stayed high and tried to read the shadows. The other swung low to flank. Sarah inhaled slow, settled the sight on the low man's thigh, and squeezed. The crack tumbled back at her from both walls. The man shouted and dropped. His leg went wrong under him, and he rolled out of sight behind a boulder. The second man ducked, cursed, and fired blind. Chips of rock skipped off the lip in a hard rain. Sarah waited until the echo died, then put a second shot wide on purpose so it would slap the farther wall and sound like a partner. The air held. No one pushed forward. Silence rang in the gap. A horse stamped and pulled at a rein. Far off a hawk called once and went quiet. Sarah listened with her mouth open and tasted sulfur on the back of her tongue. She kept the barrel steady another count of 10 and then pulled back from the notch. Cole had sagged against the rock. The blood had slowed, but not stopped. His face shone with sweat. She touched his cheek with the back of her hand and felt heat. Stay with me, she said. His smile came up crooked. You are bossy. Only with the living. She slid a hand under his shirt and found the entry just below his ribs. Clean, no exit. The angle of the notch had spared his spine and organs that could not spare blood. She looked at the wound, then at the little pile of things she had. Water, strips of linen rolled tight, a knife, a match tin. Hold here. She pressed his hand to the pad of cloth and felt him bear down, like a rider takes slack out of a rein. She struck a match in the shadow of the rock and watched the flame steady. She warmed the knife over it until the metal changed color. The smell of hot steel took her back to nights when men burned brands into new hide. She moved careful and did not rush the fire. When the blade would sizzle a drop of water, she let the match go and brought the knife close. This will be bad, she said. I have had worse, he lied. She set the edge near the wound and touched in light and quick. The sound was small. The smell crossed the air and went away on the wind. His breath skipped. His eyes found the notch and then came back to her. She counted to 5 before she did the second press. The blood eased from a spill to a slow well. She pressed a folded cloth and tied it in place with a clean strip knot, low and flat so nothing would bite when he moved. She looked at it hard and made the knot again neater until the tuck sat right. The bead at her throat knocked once against her collarbone and settled. She slipped it under the edge of the bandage that wrapped her wrist the same way she had the night before, not for luck now, but to move her hands along a path they knew. She wiped the blade on a piece of torn shirt and slid it back into its sheath. The match tin went in her pocket. She took one more breath ready and steady and looked up. The notch was empty. A faint line of dust showed where horses had backtracked to a cut in the rock. The men had pulled away to lick their own hurt. She waited in the hollow, counted to 30, then to 60, then to 100 with the rhythm of a person who had sown all winter and knew how to keep a beat. No sound came but wind. We move, she said. Cole set his jaw and nodded. She slung his arm over her shoulders and stood with him. He held his weight as best he could. They reached the horses in short pulls with little rests between. She boosted him into the saddle and felt his boot find the stirrup by habit. She mounted and took both reins in her left hand and the spencer in her right. The notch spit them out into open country. Light ran flat across the flats. Heat waves climbed and fell in slow movement. Sarah kept her horse steady and let Comet set the pace that a hurt man could sit. When Cole began to list, she reached across and took a handful of his shirt to hold him true. He did not complain. He saved his breath for the part where breath mattered. They found the wash and followed its ribs south. Creosote brushed their knees and left a clean smell behind each branch. Quail burst from cover in little groups. The sky went the color of copper with smoke in it. The sun slid down the backside of the day and left the air cooler if not kind. Cole spoke once, water. She gave him the canteen and watched him take small swallows. He coughed and made a face at the taste of iron on his tongue. He shook his head when she offered more. She tied the canteen back and kept the horses moving. By night the stars hung low and sharp. The moon came thin and bright. The ground under hoof turned from stone to soft, then to stone again. Coyotes called and the sound ran along the ridges. Cole's head dipped and came up again. Sarah talked low to the horses and to the quiet between their steps. She did not tell him the distance. She did not add numbers to a thing that would be done by muscle and will. Toward dawn a river smell came cool and green, where the world had been nothing but brown and burnt. Cottonwoods appeared like a dream that decided to be true. Grass showed in strips where the bank held water under its top skin. Sarah turned into a stand of willow that hid a shallow bend. Water riffled on small stones and showed a path where horses had crossed before and not sunk. She eased Comet down the bank until his forefeet found purchase and his ears came forward. She let him feel his way. The current was low. The cold licked her boots and then climbed to her shin. She scruffed her mount with a heel when it thought to jump and felt it change its mind. Cole grunted once when the cold reached his leg. He held the horn and kept his eyes open. They came out on the far side with mud on the fetlocks. Sarah turned the horses into the trees and kept them moving. Birds started, then settled. A cottonwood leaf turned its pale side to the new light, and then back. She stopped in a hollow where no line of sight ran clean for more than 20 paces. She slid down and went to Cole. His face had gone gray where it had been pale. The bandage showed a dark shape that had not been there an hour ago. She pressed her palm to his cheek. His skin felt cool and damp. "Stay awake," she said. He tried. He swallowed and found his voice. "You draw a good bird," he said. She huffed something that almost laughed. "You are leaking on my work." His mouth crooked. It slipped away fast. His eyes rolled half shut. She took his hand and put it around the saddle horn to give his body a reason to sit upright. She tightened the wrap on his middle, working by feel and not by sight. The knot held flat. The tuck stayed put. A sound came from far to the north, not loud, just a note of dust in the air that did not belong to wind. Sarah listened until her ears went hot with trying. The sound slipped in and out like a fish taking a fly and not committing. She closed her eyes and smelled creosote and wet bark and the iron of blood. When she opened them again, Cole's head had dipped against his shoulder. She caught his chin and lifted it with her knuckles. "Look at me," she said. His eyes cleared for a breath. He found her and stayed there. The copper bead touched his wrist when she reached for his pulse. It beat against her fingertips, slow and stubborn. She drew a small thunderbird with her nail in the dry skin beside the stirrup, just 3 lines for wings and 1 for the tail. The shape caught a smear of dawn light and held it. Leaves above them turned in a small wind that moved nowhere else. Far away the air raised a faint taste of dust and left it there thin and waiting. Morning came through the willows like a careful hand. The river made its small noise against stones. Sarah watched the light crawl up the trunks and then settle into the leaves. Cole slept propped against his saddle, his breath thin, but even a hand still hooked on the horn, like the body kept faith with old habits. She pressed the back of her fingers to his temple. The fever had broken in the hours when the stars were the only light. They rested until the shadows shortened. Sarah found a trail through the cottonwoods where hooves had passed in 1s and 2s, not in files. The land opened to grass that held the shine of water underneath. She led the horses slow under a sky the color of tin. Cole stirred and blinked at the trees, then at her. He tried to sit taller and let it go when pain argued. "We crossed," he said. "We did," she answered. He looked at the bead at her throat. It had left a small green mark on her skin where copper had met sweat. He smiled and let his eyes close for a slow count before lifting them again. They followed the river south until it bent around a tongue of rock and went quiet behind a stand of pine that had found some high water to live on. The smell changed to resin and clean bark. A slope rose, then leveled. There, tucked along the bend, a patch of ground held earth soft enough to take a stake. Days stacked without hurry. Cole mended a fence from deadfall pine and old wire he found under brush. Sierra cut saplings and split them with the camp axe until they sat neat in a pile that would become walls. She learned the sound of the axe head finding the grain and not fighting it. He taught her to set a post so it would not lean when the wind came. She showed him the way to weave willow into a panel that would throw shade without trapping heat. The work talked to their hands. Words did the rest when needed. Cole healed slow. The wound turned from red to pink under the cloth. The limp stayed with him and made him deliberate. He walked as if every step belonged to a choice he was willing to make. Sarah watched him tie knots one-handed when he had to check them and left them if they held. He listened to her cough when the dust rose and fetched water without speaking. He slept with the Spencer near for a while, then set it farther away when the trees began to feel like neighbors. They raised a shelter that asked for no apology. The roof sat low and shed rain when a gray morning finally let loose a brief shower. The sound on the boards was soft and fast gone before it finished soaking the dust. Sarah carved the sill with Cole's knife, small strokes patient until a bird looked back at her. Wings out, tail like tongues of flame, just where a thumb would brush when a person came and went. "For crossing fire," she said. The words went into the wood the way water goes into seed. Cole leaned a hand on the jamb and read the lines with his fingers. He nodded once and looked out at the corral. He had started a circle wide enough to let a horse move, but small enough to hold its mind still. The scrub mustang he had gentled first watched from the far side with its ears half forward, half unsure. Cole clicked his tongue. The horse lifted its head and gave him one eye. He stepped into the pen with his hands low and open. He watched the horse watch him. He turned his shoulder and waited for curiosity to pull the feet forward. It did. Sierra sat on the step and stitched. Cloth, rough and clean, lay over her knee. She made a small shirt from a flour sack she had scrubbed until the print was a ghost. The seams went straight because her hands did not mind repeating a good line. She held the copper bead against the throat opening and tested how it would catch. It was small and a little ugly in a way that made it honest. She worked a loop of red thread into the hole and pulled it snug. The bead sat where a button lives. It shone dull and warm. Cole came from the pen with dust on his boots and relief in his shoulders. He looked at the shirt and then at her. His eyes went to her belly without prying. Her hand settled there without thinking, just for a beat, and then went back to the needle. "If it is a boy," he said, the words shaped like a dry smile. "He learns to ride loose and shoot standing," she said. She kept her eyes on the stitch so the line would hold. Cole crouched and set his palms to the step. He sat in a way that did not pull his side. He took off his hat and let the sun on his hair. The pocket watch sat in his vest. He fished it out and clicked the lid. The hands lay 7 minutes behind the light. He listened to the tick and set it on the sill beside the Thunderbird, as if the bird might keep it honest. The glass made a small circle of bright that moved slow on the wood. They ate in the evenings without hurry. Beans and jerky softened in river water, flatbread that puffed in spots and tasted better because it was hot, Sierra cut apples they had bought with a bridle and a promise to work 3 colts when the owner came south. Cole sprinkled spice he kept in a twist of paper and watched her take a bite and close her eyes for a second as the taste hit. Nights brought cool air that smelled like water and pine and clean dirt. They sat near a small fire that never reached for the trees. Sarah told a short story about her mother picking berries under Black Rock where lizards warmed themselves at dawn. Cole told the story of a winter he had spent on a high range when the snow went blue at noon and made the world hold its sound. The stories were not long. They did not need to be. When sleep took them, it did it without surprise. Cole lay on his side on a pallet that held cedar shavings under cloth. Sarah lay on her back and listened to frogs claim the river. Her hand found the bead at her throat and settled there. She kept one lamp low on the table to learn the shadows of the room. When she woke in the dark, she could tell where everything was by the way the dark held it. Sometimes a breeze carried the faint shape of hooves from far away. She listened and let it be a memory of a sound that belonged on the other side of water. She would go to the door and stand with a hand on the Thunderbird she had carved. The wood felt cool and smooth where the lines were deepest. She would feel the small swell of her body under her palm and think of a name she had not said aloud yet. One afternoon, Cole found her at the river bare feet in the shallows, skirt hitched to her knees. She held a fish in both hands like a prize a child would bring to an uncle. Water flashed off the scales. She laughed in her throat and handed him the catch. He grinned in a way that made him look younger than the scars said he was. "You keep feeding me like this," he said, "I will forget how to cook beans." "You will remember when I burn the next one," she answered. They strung a line between two pines and hung shirts that wind could ride through. Sierra pinned the small one with care. The copper bead caught sun and gave it back in a small copper flame. Cole watched it spin once and stop. On a day when clouds climbed over the far ridge and then decided to rest there, Cole stood at the fence and watched the Mustang move in a slow circle. The horse's head dropped, the back softened, the feet found a steady beat. He leaned on the rail and let his jaw loosen. Sierra came to the gate and set her chin on the top board. The smell of creosote rode up from somewhere and brought a memory with it. She let the memory pass through and leave. Inside the cabin, she set the pocket watch on a shelf and left it open. It ticked its late tick at the same pace as ever. She touched it with one finger and felt its small work against the world. She looked over at Cole through the open door. He stood in the yard with his hat pushed back, one hand raised palm out, a shape of a man asking a horse to trust him. The Thunderbird on the sill watched them both with its carved calm. In the soft of evening, when the light had turned thin and kind, Sarah drew her nail across the doorwood and added a tiny line beneath the bird, a mark only she would read. She closed the door with her hand on the carving. The room held the cool and the quiet they had earned. The river went on saying its same small thing. The watch clicked. The knot on the bandage under Cole's shirt lay flat and true. The copper bead shone dull at the throat of a tiny shirt that waited on a peg. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.